Have you ever wondered how close a family can be to losing everything? Not in a year, not in a month, but overnight. In America today, more than 2.5 million children will sleep in a car, a shelter, or a place not meant for humans, and most people will never know their names. But if I told you one of those stories began with a wealthy family, a locked door, and a mother trying to keep four shivering children warm inside a broken-down minivan, would you believe it? Some stories begin with hope, some begin with tragedy. But this one, the story of Eleanor Ruiz, begins at the exact moment her world collapsed, and the moment she discovered just how fragile security really is. And what happened next, no one saw coming. Let's step into her night and uncover the truth hidden behind it. Most families fear losing their homes someday. Eleanor lost hers in 6 minutes. They say a home is the safest place in the world. But for Eleanor Ruiz, that belief shattered on the coldest night of her life. It began with the slam of a door, sharp, final, echoing through the marble hallway of the Whitlock estate, like a verdict. One moment, she was a grieving widow trying to hold her family together. And the next, she was standing on the front steps in nothing but a thin parka, watching snow swallow the driveway while four small children clung to her legs in confusion. Most people never imagine what eviction looks like when it's done quietly, behind the gates of a wealthy neighborhood. But sometimes cruelty wears designer coats and speaks in polite tones. And on that night, cruelty had a last name: Whitlock. Eleanor didn't argue. She didn't scream. She simply held her children tighter as suitcases, boxes, and garbage bags were tossed onto the frozen porch like discarded donations. 8-year-old Mia trembled so hard her teeth chattered. 6-year-old Jonas, on the spectrum, sensitive to noise and chaos, covered his ears and rocked back and forth, overwhelmed. Little Ruby, barely 4, kept asking why Grandma Whitlock was throwing away her drawings, and baby Benji, only 2, whimpered softly, his cheeks flushed from the icy wind. These were the moments that define a mother, not the good days, but the nights when she has to decide whether to break or to hold the world together with shaking hands. No one passing by would have guessed that just months earlier, Eleanor had lived in this same house, cooking meals, folding laundry, paying bills she could barely afford after her husband, Aaron Whitlock, died in a construction accident. She moved in because she believed his family would help her recover. Instead, she was treated like an unpaid maid in a home full of chandeliers and cold hearts. Studies show that over 30% of widowed women in the U.S. fall into poverty within 5 years, especially those who depended on their spouse's income. Eleanor became part of that statistic long before she ever realized it. Margaret Whitlock, Aaron's mother, stood in the porch with her arms crossed tightly, as if holding in years of bitterness. "You should have been grateful," she said, voice sharp as the wind. "But gratitude is something you never learned." Eleanor wanted to say she had cooked every meal in that house, stayed up through every night when Jonas had sensory overload, and cleaned the same rooms Margaret proudly boasted about on charity tours. But she swallowed the words. Arguing with people who never intended to understand you is like shouting into a blizzard. Your voice disappears before it hits the ground. A single black trash bag rolled down the steps. Inside were children's coats, thin, cheap ones Margaret bought because there's no point spoiling them. Eleanor knelt to gather the bag, her fingers numb and burning from the cold. As she reached for it, Margaret added the line that would haunt her for months. "Get off our property before midnight. I won't have you taking advantage of us any longer." The irony was painful. For years, Eleanor had lived under their roof, not as family, but as a reminder of everything Margaret despised: imperfection, vulnerability, a woman with 4 children she never approved of. In moments like this, people say time slows down. For Eleanor, it didn't. Everything sped up, her heartbeat, her breaths, the shaking of her hands as she tried to bundle her children in too thin layers. She knew what the statistics said. On any given night, more than 600,000 Americans have no place to sleep, and among them are nearly 200,000 children. She also knew that once she stepped off this property, she would join them. The thought was crushing, terrifying, but strangely clarifying, because sometimes the fall you fear the most becomes the beginning of a different kind of strength. When the gate finally closed behind her, a metallic, echoing finality, Eleanor walked toward the minivan Aaron bought used years before. The windshield was cracked, the engine unreliable, but tonight it was all she had. She loaded the kids in slowly, one by one, whispering comfort she didn't feel. The engine struggled, coughed, then finally turned over. Snow caked the headlights as she pulled away from the house. Watching its warm windows fade behind her, she didn't cry. She had 4 pairs of eyes, watching, and when you're a mother, you learn to swallow your tears, even when they burn like fire. But this night held a quiet lesson, one Eleanor wouldn't understand fully until much later. Sometimes life takes everything from you, not to punish you, but to show you who you become without the things you thought you needed. Strength is not built in soft rooms or warm hallways. It is carved in the cold, in the dark, in the moments when you have no choice but to keep driving. As the minivan rolled into the silent, snowy highway, Eleanor gripped the wheel, whispering to herself, "Just one night. We just need to survive one night." She didn't know that this night would turn into many. She didn't know how hard the next weeks would be. And she certainly didn't know that somewhere out there, someone was searching for her. A search that would lead to a twist so unbelievable it could only be found in stories. Except this one was real. And that is where the long road begins. A mother in a dying car, 4 children bundled in fear and blankets, and a world that keeps moving while hers falls apart. But survival has a way of revealing hidden paths, and Eleanor was about to discover one. Survival doesn't feel dramatic when you're living it. It feels strangely normal. The first night in the minivan was the longest of Eleanor's life. Snow whispered against the windows, but inside the air was painfully still, thick with fear, cold breath, and the sound of 4 children trying to understand why their world had suddenly shrunk into a metal box. Most people imagine homelessness as tents or shelters, but the truth is different. Over half of homeless families in America live in their cars, hidden behind fogged windows in Walmart lots, hospital garages, and quiet streets where no one thinks to look. Eleanor hadn't known that fact before, but now she felt it in her bones. She tucked Mia and Ruby together under Aaron's old work jacket, pulled Jonas close, despite his sensitivity to touch, and wrapped tiny Benji inside her coat, holding him against her heartbeat like a promise she was still trying to believe. The heater had stopped working years ago, so she cracked the window slightly to prevent the glass from icing over completely. Every few minutes she leaned forward and breathed onto her hands, trying to push warmth back into aching fingers. Morning didn't bring relief, just a different kind of exhaustion. Eleanor drove around aimlessly, not because she had a destination, but because parking too long in one place meant someone might knock on the window and ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. She found a grocery store with a bathroom big enough for her to wet paper towels and wipe down the kids' faces. Jonas covered his ears each time the bathroom door slammed, overwhelmed by the noise, and she whispered apologies, even though she had no other choice. For breakfast, she split a single granola bar 4 ways, 1 bite for each child and none for herself. Hunger has a sound, and in that cramped minivan it echoed loudly. By noon, she'd learned the unspoken rules of surviving in a car. Keep moving, keep low, keep quiet. Don't draw attention. Don't let anyone call Child Protective Services. Not because you're a bad mother, but because the system sees poverty before it sees love. By the second night, the walls of the minivan felt closer, the space tighter, the cold sharper. Walmart allowed overnight parking, but that didn't mean people slept peacefully. Every hour, headlights swept across their windows, jolting Ruby awake. Benji coughed in his sleep, a wet, raspy sound that made Eleanor panic at every breath. She wrapped him tighter and whispered stories of warm places, beaches they'd never been to, campfires they'd never sat beside, just to drown out the truth that their reality was the opposite. This was not adventure. This was survival. And in America, 38% of the homeless population are families, most of them single mothers, doing exactly what Eleanor was doing now, pretending they weren't breaking so their children wouldn't break before them. There were moments of unexpected kindness, glimmers of humanity that kept Eleanor from falling apart completely. One morning, a man in a faded truck slipped a $20 bill through the cracked window without waiting for thanks. For the kids, he murmured, and walked away. Another day, an older woman loading groceries into her car noticed the 4 little faces pressed against the minivan window and came back with a bag of fruit snacks and juice boxes. Small things, but big enough to remind Eleanor that the world wasn't entirely cruel. Still, there were darker moments, too. A security guard banging on the window at 2 a.m. insisting they move along, or a mother in a warm SUV staring too long, a look of pity mixed with fear. Poverty is contagious in the eyes of those who have never been close to it. People look away not because they don't care, but because they're afraid it could happen to them too. Through it all, Eleanor learned lessons she never wanted to learn. She learned how to calculate gas versus heat versus miles to the next quiet parking lot. She learned that libraries were sanctuaries, warm, quiet, no questions asked. She learned to hide her exhaustion behind smiles so the children wouldn't feel guilty for something that wasn't their fault. And she learned that strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a woman sitting behind a steering wheel at 3 a.m., trying to plan tomorrow when she doesn't know how to survive tonight. But the hardest lesson was realizing that desperation changes people, not into monsters, but into shadows of themselves. She caught her reflection in the rearview mirror one night, her eyes hollow and tired, and she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Still, somewhere inside that shattered version of herself, a spark refused to die. Every time she looked at her children curled together like small birds, that spark grew just enough to carry her into another hour, another morning. But survival has limits. By the end of the first week, gas was down to fumes, food was gone, and the cold had become the enemy she could no longer outrun. Benji's fever spiked, and his tiny body shook in her arms. The minivan felt like a coffin, and Eleanor felt herself unraveling. In that moment, she whispered a sentence she never imagined she'd say, "I need help," from anywhere. Sometimes the world answers quietly, but unexpectedly, because just as Eleanor's strength began to fade, a shadow approached the minivan window. A knock, soft, uncertain, but undeniably intentional. She froze. Was it a guard? A stranger? A threat? Or something else entirely? And that fragile question is what leads us into the next chapter, the moment a stranger changed the course of her life, forever. There's a moment in every storm when you can't tell if you're drowning or finally learning how to breathe. By the end of the second week, Eleanor had pushed every limit she had, physical, emotional, and the kind that lives deep in the soul, where a person keeps the last bit of belief that things will somehow get better. But even strength has a breaking point, and hers arrived on a gray morning when the cold settled so deeply inside the minivan that breathing felt like inhaling ice. Benji had been coughing through the night, but at sunrise his little body went still in a way that terrified her. Then the coughing returned, harder, sharper, violent. His skin burned against her palm. Fever, high, too high. She stripped off her own jacket to wrap him tighter, but his lips remained pale, almost bluish. Panic rose in her throat like a wave she couldn't hold back. She'd read the statistics once. Almost 1 in 5 homeless children develop severe respiratory illness within a month of losing stable housing, but she never imagined her son would become one of them. Not like this. Not in the back of a freezing van. She took a risk she'd been avoiding since the day they left the Whitlock estate. She rushed into a drugstore, carrying Benji against her shoulder, his cries thin and weak. She grabbed Fever Reducer off the shelf and headed straight to the counter. She wasn't trying to hide. She wasn't thinking about the price, only about time. But to the cashier, all he saw was a woman with messy hair, dark circles, and a baby who looked too sick to wait. He didn't hear the desperation in her voice when she said, "Please," only the suspicion in his own mind. "Ma'am," he snapped, "you need to pay for that." Before Eleanor could even reach for her wallet, a security guard stepped between them, hand already hovering over the radio. "Is this going to be a problem?" he asked. The question wasn't really a question. It was a warning, a judgment, a sentence disguised as protocol. Behind her, Mia stood frozen in the doorway, watching her mother being treated like a criminal. And, in that moment, something inside Eleanor cracked, the quiet humiliation of poverty turning into something heavier, something that makes a person want to disappear. The guard escorted her to the door, insisting she leave. No one offered to help. No one asked if the baby was okay. They simply wanted her gone so the store could return to normal. But Eleanor's life wasn't normal. It hadn't been for a long time. She stumbled back to the van, tears burning her vision, clutching Benji so tightly she was afraid she might hurt him. Jonas rocked in the back seat, overwhelmed by the shouting he'd heard, and Ruby sobbed without understanding why everyone else was scared. It was chaos, inside a metal shell, and Eleanor couldn't breathe. The pressure, the helplessness, the shame, it all pressed down like the sky itself had collapsed on her shoulders. She sat behind the steering wheel, one hand gripping it so hard her knuckles went white, and the other cradling her feverish son. For the first time since Aaron's death, she felt truly alone, not just without help, but without hope. And then came the moment she would later describe as the silent collapse. She didn't scream. She didn't pound the dashboard. She didn't yell at the universe for being unfair. She simply lowered her forehead onto the steering wheel and let the tears fall without trying to stop them. Because sometimes the breaking point is not loud. Sometimes it's when a mother realizes she has nothing left to trade for another day of survival. And yet, even then, she whispered to her children that everything would be okay. Not because she believed it, but because she needed them to believe it long enough for her to figure out the next move. That tiny moment, the lie told out of love, was the thread that kept her from unraveling completely. In the darkness of that crisis, a quiet truth emerged. Poverty is not just the absence of money. It is the absence of time, choices, dignity. It is the constant fear of being seen and not being helped, of needing and being punished for needing. It is a system that tells mothers, like Eleanor, that their existence is an inconvenience. And yet, even in her breaking, she learned something she would carry for the rest of her life. Strength isn't measured by how much you can endure, but by how quickly you stand back up for the people who depend on you. Pain became clarity. Fear became resolve. She wiped her tears, restarted the engine, and swore she'd find a way to get her children through one more night, no matter what it cost her. But life has a strange way of shifting at the exact moment things reach their worst. Because just when Eleanor thought she had reached the end of what she could survive, a shadow approached the fogged driver's side window. A knock, firm, slow, deliberate. Not the knock of a security guard. Not the knock of someone telling her to move. A different kind of knock, the kind that feels like a question. Are you the one I've been searching for? And that single sound would lead her into the next chapter of her life. The arrival of a man who carried news so unbelievable it would change everything. Help never arrives when you expect it, but sometimes it shows up wearing a suit and holding a briefcase. The knock came again, steady, measured, almost polite, and for a moment Eleanor froze, unsure if she should breathe or run. On nights like these, danger often arrived quietly. She wiped her face quickly, trying to look composed for the sake of her children, even though her heart thudded hard enough to shake the breath from her chest. She cracked the window an inch, just enough to see the outline of a man bundled in an elegant wool coat, the kind worn by people who never had to count quarters for gas. His posture was careful, respectful, as if he understood he was approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any second. When he spoke, his voice was warm but precise, British, unmistakably. Mrs. Eleanor Ruiz? Hearing her name spoken with such gentleness in the middle of a freezing parking lot felt unreal, like a scene from a life that didn't belong to her anymore. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "My name is Charles Bainbridge," he said, lifting a leather ID holder toward the window. "I've been trying to locate you for 8 weeks. May we speak?" 8 weeks. Eleanor blinked, confused. Nobody searched for women living in vans. Nobody looked twice. And yet, here was a man who looked like he belonged in a courtroom or at a boardroom table, standing in the cracked asphalt of a Walmart lot, snowflakes gathering on his shoulders. Charles glanced past her to the back seat, where Mia held Benji close and Jonas rocked silently, overwhelmed by the presence of a stranger. His expression softened with genuine concern, not pity, but recognition, the kind you see in people who understand urgency without needing it explained. "It's far too cold for the children," he said quietly. "Would you allow me to bring you all to my office? 10 minutes away, warmth, seating, privacy." His tone was not pushy or patronizing. It was the tone of someone who knows that trust is earned slowly, especially from people who have been hurt enough times to flinch at every offer of kindness. "Please," he added, "I promise you, I mean no harm." Eleanor hesitated, running through every worst-case scenario in her head. She'd been warned her whole life that nothing good happens for free. And yet, something in his eyes felt steady, anchored, like the first piece of solid ground she'd seen in weeks. She followed his car cautiously, ready to veer away at the first sign of danger. But the building he led her to was real. A brick office downtown with warm lights, tall windows, and the polished brass plaque of Bainbridge, Lowell, and Ashford, International Estate Law. Inside, the contrast was overwhelming. Heat wrapped around her like a blanket. The receptionist rose immediately, not with judgment at her worn coat and shivering children, but with empathy. She brought blankets, warm tea, bottled water. For the first time in days, Eleanor felt her shoulders relax just a fraction. Charles ushered her into a private conference room with soft chairs and thick carpets, a different universe from the van where her children had slept the night before. He opened a leather folder, carefully sliding out documents that looked too official, too crisp for her reality. "I know this is overwhelming," he began, "but I'd like to explain why I'm here." His words came slowly, as if he wanted to give her time to absorb each one. "Your great-aunt, Lucinda Bell, passed away 2 months ago. She left behind a considerable estate, and she named you as her primary beneficiary." Eleanor's breath hitched. Great-aunt? Lucinda? The name pierced something familiar, a memory half buried under years of survival. A woman with silver hair and bright red lipstick who sent birthday cards with glittery envelopes when Eleanor was small. A woman who disappeared after Eleanor's parents died. "I don't understand," she whispered. Charles nodded, anticipating the confusion. "She lived abroad for most of her life. Quiet, private, very wealthy, and she followed your life more closely than you realize." He explained how Lucinda had hired a private investigator, not to control Eleanor, but to ensure she was safe, to check if she needed help. And each report broke her heart a little more. The cramped basement room in the Whitlock estate, the unpaid labor, the emotional abuse, the children being treated like burdens instead of blessings. Then came the final report, the one describing Eleanor and her 4 children living in a van during the brutal winter. "She wanted to intervene sooner," Charles said softly, "but she believed you would refuse charity. So she designed her estate with conditions only you could fulfill." He slid a paper toward her. Numbers. More zeros than she'd ever seen in her life. At first, her mind refused to make sense of it. She counted once, twice. The room felt lighter, unreal. $184 million, he said gently, plus properties, equity holdings, and a direct emergency fund of $300,000 available today. Eleanor felt her throat close, not from excitement, but from disbelief so deep it felt like grief, because no one tells you how heavy hope can feel when you haven't held it for so long. She shook her head slowly. This can't be real. Charles didn't argue. He simply placed an envelope in front of her. Your aunt left you a letter, he said. Perhaps her words will make it real. Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers, expecting legal jargon or distant condolences. Instead, she found handwriting that felt like a voice reaching across decades. My dearest Eleanor, it began, I have watched your strength in silence for far too long. The letter spoke of admiration, of regret, of pride. Lucinda wrote of how she saw in Eleanor the resilience of her mother, the kindness of her father, and a courage Eleanor never claimed for herself. This is not charity, the letter read. This is justice, this is freedom, and this is the life you deserved long before now. By the time she reached the final line, even stars love from a distance. Eleanor was crying openly, silently, the way people cry when they are no longer able to pretend they're not tired. In that warm conference room, surrounded by documents that would change her future forever, Eleanor realized something quietly profound. Sometimes the people meant to protect you fail in every way, and sometimes the ones who save you are the ones you never thought to look for. Her entire world had shifted in the space between two breaths. But with that shift came questions she wasn't ready to answer. Questions about the Whitlocks, about her children's future, about the sudden weight of choices she never imagined she'd have. And she understood, on a level she couldn't yet put into words, that with this inheritance came power, and with power came clarity. She looked at Charles, her voice steadier than she expected. What happens now? He closed the folder gently and replied, Now we make sure you and your children are safe, and then you decide the life you want to build. But safety comes with its own storms, because the moment word of the inheritance reached the wrong ears, another door would open, one leading straight back to the people who had thrown her into the cold. And that is where the next chapter begins. The reckoning with the Whitlocks. The most dangerous thing in the world is a woman who finally remembers her worth. News travels fast in wealthy families, not because they care, but because they panic. It took less than 24 hours for the Whitlocks to learn that the woman they threw out into the snow was now the heir to a fortune bigger than anything their estate had ever touched. Phones buzzed, old friends whispered, and Eleanor's silence, for the first time in her life, terrified them. She didn't intend to confront them immediately, but the messages flooded in, first disguised as concern, then urgency, then entitlement. We need to talk. Families should stick together. Come home. The word home made her sick. A home does not throw children out into the night. A house does. Finally, when their attorney reached out demanding a meeting to discuss the children's financial interests, Eleanor realized something important. Dignity is reclaimed not in whispers, but in sunlight, and she was done hiding in the dark. Charles arranged the meeting at his downtown office, the same warm, quiet place where she had first learned her life was no longer defined by survival alone. When the Whitlocks arrived, they brought with them the scent of cold perfume, expensive wool, and fear dressed up as confidence. Margaret entered first, wearing pearls and a smile so tight it could have been painted on. Her husband, Richard, followed behind, his posture stiff, his eyes scanning the room not for Eleanor, but for the documents that represented the money he now desperately wanted access to. They sat across from her at the polished mahogany table, separated not only by physical space, but by the weight of everything they had done. Eleanor didn't speak at first. She let the silence stretch long enough to make them uncomfortable, long enough to reclaim the space they'd stolen from her. When Margaret finally opened her mouth, her voice was coated in honey. "Eleanor, dear, we've been so worried. Leaving like that, well, it wasn't wise. The children must miss their real home." That word again, home. It landed between them like a stone dropped into ice water. Eleanor lifted her eyes, calm, steady, nothing like the trembling woman they'd last seen. "You mean the house where you threw my children into the snow?" she asked quietly. The mask slipped from Margaret's face so fast it almost echoed. Richard cleared his throat, as if attempting to regain control. "Let's not exaggerate. You were emotional. We all were. What matters now is how we handle this inheritance responsibly. As their grandparents, we are entitled to—" No. The word was soft, but final, a boundary slicing through the air with the precision of a clean blade. Margaret leaned forward. "Eleanor, you can't possibly manage that amount of money alone. Think of the children, their education, their future." Eleanor could almost laugh at the irony. These were the same people who refused to buy new shoes for Mia, who rationed food to Ruby because they didn't want to spoil her, who ignored Jonas's sensory needs because boys need to toughen up. She breathed slowly, letting the truth settle. "I did think of the children," she said. "Every night we slept in a van. Every day they were cold and hungry because you made sure they had nothing. You had 4 empty bedrooms, and you left them outside." Charles placed a folder on the table and opened it with deliberate calm. "Before we continue," he said, "you should both know something." Inside were records of every interaction he and his firm had with the Whitlocks, phone calls, emails, even the transcript of their first meeting. On the first page, highlighted in bold, was the date they had been informed of Lucinda Bell's estate. It was 8 weeks before the night they threw Eleanor out. 8 weeks of silence while they attended charity galas and hosted curated dinners, meant to show the world their generosity. 8 weeks of pretending they knew nothing while they strategically positioned themselves to take advantage of an estate that didn't belong to them. Eleanor watched their faces carefully. Richard went pale. Margaret's jaw twitched, the only sign of the panic cracking beneath her skin. "You knew," Eleanor said. "You knew about the inheritance before you threw us out. And you didn't tell me." Richard straightened in his chair, trying to salvage whatever power he had left. "We needed time to understand the legalities," he said. "It wasn't your place to manage an estate of that size. We weren't sure you'd be stable enough to—" Eleanor cut him off gently. "Stable? You left a toddler with a fever in the snow. You ignored every medical need, every emotional need, every basic human need those children had. You didn't care about stability. You cared about control." The room stilled. Not even the hum of the heater dared break the tension. For a moment, Eleanor saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. Real fear. The kind that comes when powerful people realize they have no leverage left. And In that moment, she learned one of the greatest lessons her new life would offer. When you reclaim your dignity, those who built their power on your silence lose theirs instantly. She didn't need revenge. Their downfall had already begun the moment she stood up straighter than they ever expected her to. Margaret's voice softened into desperation. "Eleanor, you can't cut us out. We're family." Eleanor met her gaze calmly. "Family doesn't abandon you, and family doesn't return only when money does." She rose from her chair, smoothing her coat, not with arrogance, but with a quiet grace that comes from knowing your life no longer belongs to those who once belittled it. "You will not have access to this inheritance," she continued. "You will not make decisions for my children, and you will never speak to me as if I owe you anything ever again." Charles nodded in agreement, sliding legal documents toward them. "You'll both be receiving a notice limiting all contact effective immediately," he said. Eleanor gathered her things, ready to leave this chapter behind. But before she stepped out, she paused, hesitating only long enough to teach the most important lesson she'd learned since the night she lost everything. "Dignity," she said softly, "isn't something you get back when others apologize. It's something you reclaim when you finally stop apologizing for surviving." She walked out of the conference room with her head held high. A simple action, but one that felt like rewriting her entire life from the inside out. Outside, the air was crisp, no longer the suffocating cold she remembered from the nights in the van. She breathed deeply, not because she needed to catch her breath, but because, for the first time, she finally could. But reclaiming dignity was just one step. The next chapter would demand something bigger, rebuilding a life worth living. And that journey begins with choosing a home, not a shelter, a future, not a fight. Money fixes roofs and bills, but healing? Healing requires something far more complicated. For the first time in months, Eleanor woke up without the sound of shivering children or the stiffness of a car seat beneath her. She opened her eyes to a ceiling she hadn't seen before, a soft cream color, warm light streaming through drapes that whispered when the morning breeze touched them. The four-seasoned suite was only temporary, but for her children, it felt like a planet they'd never visited. The first night, Mia cried because the pillows were too soft, and Jonas paced the room, overwhelmed by all the open space. Ruby slept with her shoes on because she was afraid losing them might mean losing the bed too. And little Benji, still recovering, clutched Eleanor's fingers all night, as if afraid she might vanish. Even in comfort, trauma left fingerprints. And that was the strange thing Eleanor discovered. Escaping poverty physically was far easier than escaping it mentally. Even surrounded by warmth and safety, she felt the ghost of cold nights waiting just behind her shoulder. The first week of their new chapter was a crash course in rediscovering how to live instead of merely survive. With Charles's help, she met realtors, financial advisors, and pediatric specialists who treated her children with more compassion in one appointment than the Whitlocks had in 5 years. The children received thorough checkups, therapy referrals, and warm winter clothes that actually fit. Yet every small decision brought a wave of anxiety she didn't expect. When she stood inside a luxury home with 5 bedrooms and polished floors, her chest tightened, not out of joy, but out of fear. Fear that choosing wrong would somehow send them back to the van. Fear that she didn't deserve something so beautiful. Fear that this was temporary. Trauma teaches you to wait for the rug to be pulled out from under you. Even wealth could not silence that voice overnight. Still, Eleanor chose a house, not a mansion, not a palace, but a home. A two-story craftsman on the edge of a quiet neighborhood with tall oak trees in the front yard and a garden she could bring back to life in the spring. The realtor kept describing it as charming and classic. But for Eleanor, the real magic was in the small details. 4 bedrooms, so none of the children had to share unless they wanted to. A cozy sunroom where morning light poured in like honey, and a large kitchen where she could cook meals without being watched, judged, or shamed. The day they moved in, she let the children choose their rooms. Mia picked the one with the biggest window. Jonas chose the smallest room because it made him feel safe, like a nest. Ruby picked a room with a view of the garden, and Benji, of course, stayed close to her. Their laughter echoed through the empty house like bells, filling corners that had been quiet for far too long. But building a new life wasn't just about comfort. It was about confronting the weight she still carried. Eleanor found herself waking at night, breath quick and uneven, convinced she heard the wind battering the minivan. She couldn't throw away the blankets from the car. She folded them neatly in a linen closet, as if they were relics of a past she couldn't completely release. She didn't let her children play outside for the first week because she unconsciously feared the world outside their walls. Trauma does that. It convinces you safety is fragile, always at risk of disappearing. And although she had money now, she knew that wealth didn't erase the memory of scarcity. It didn't erase the months she'd spent counting dollar bills and calculating how long a loaf of bread could last if she skipped meals. So she threw herself into structure, daily routines, school tours, therapy appointments, and planning. She researched everything: best schools, child development, art therapy techniques, programs for neurodivergent children. She wanted her kids to regain their childhood, not just stability. And in doing so, she found pieces of herself she thought she'd lost. The part that loved learning, the part that believed in long-term dreams, the part that once imagined a future with Aaron before everything had fallen apart. Slowly, she began to feel something she hadn't dared to feel since his death: possibility. By the 3rd week, she made a decision that would shape the direction of her life. She visited a shelter where she had once stood in line for food, carrying 4 hungry children behind her. It was smaller than she remembered, the paint peeling, the staff exhausted. Yet every face in line looked just like hers had, lost, ashamed, and trying not to cry in front of their children. Eleanor felt her heart twist as she watched a mother hush her toddler while waiting for a bag of donated groceries. She recognized the posture of exhaustion, the thin smile that hid fear, the way the woman's eyes flicked around the room searching for safety. It was like looking at her past self in a mirror she didn't ask to see. That night, as she tucked her children into bed, she made a promise: not to become a savior, not to fix everything, but to make sure no mother felt as invisible as she had. Money didn't make you whole, but it gave you the power to reach others who were breaking. And that was when the first idea for her foundation emerged. Not as a grand dream, but as a quiet whisper inside her chest. What if the life she rebuilt wasn't only for her family, but for families who had no one searching for them? Over the next month, Eleanor began turning that whisper into action. She met with outreach workers, social services, and non-profit leaders. She studied reports showing that more than 70% of homeless families are led by single mothers, most fleeing abuse, neglect, or impossible financial situations. She collected stories, faces, wounds, and the more she learned, the clearer her path became. This new life she was building wasn't just an escape from the old one, it was a platform to lift others with her. She no longer felt trapped in the echo of the van or hunted by the cold memory of the Whitlocks. She felt driven, purposeful, awake for the first time in years. But as she began building something bigger than herself, another challenge quietly approached, one she wasn't expecting. Because while Eleanor was healing, the Whitlocks were unraveling, and their unraveling would soon collide with her newfound peace. Karma doesn't knock softly. It enters like a storm you pretended didn't exist. While Eleanor was learning to breathe again, the Whitlocks were learning how quickly a life built on pride could crumble. Their world had always seemed immovable. Crystal chandeliers, manicured lawns, charity luncheons, and the illusion of stability polished to a shine. But illusions crack fast when pressure hits the right point, and the pressure had been building since the day Eleanor walked out of Charles's office. At first, it was whispers in their social circle, subtle questions that tasted sweeter than gossip, but carried the sting of judgment. "Is it true? Did you really throw the children out?" We heard, "She's the sole heir." How could you let them suffer like that? The Whitlocks were used to being admired, not questioned. The change was small at first. Friends canceling lunches, neighbors avoiding eye contact, invitations mysteriously getting lost. But reputation is fragile, and once the first fracture appears, the rest follow like fallen dominoes. Then came the financial blow. The development project Richard had invested nearly everything into, his legacy project, as he called it, collapsed under federal investigation. Mismanaged funds, contractor disputes, lawsuits piling up like snowdrifts. Investors wanted answers, and when they didn't get them, they wanted blood. Accounts froze. Properties slipped toward foreclosure. And in the middle of it all, Richard suffered a minor stroke, leaving his speech slurred and his confidence shattered. Margaret tried to hold everything together, organizing paperwork, calling bankers, begging lawyers, but the harder she tried, the faster the ground shifted beneath her feet. Wealth, she realized, was never a guarantee. It was a delicate balance of perception, relationships, and timing. And she had burned every bridge she needed to cross. The turning point came one cold morning when Margaret stood at her front door, surrounded by notices, overdue utilities, legal warnings, foreclosure paperwork. The same blue-tinted envelope they once mocked when it landed in other families' mailboxes now sat on their own porch like a final verdict. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, unable to move. Then something inside her cracked with a quiet, devastating clarity. This was not bad luck. This was consequence. The wheel of karma had turned, slowly at first, then all at once. In the hallway behind her, the walls that once echoed with elitism felt suffocating and empty. As she picked up the envelope, her hands trembled, not with anger, but with grief. Not grief for the money, but for the people she had pushed out of her life when they still would have held her hand. Panic became desperation. Desperation became humility. Margaret packed her husband's medications, a few clothes, and whatever dignity she had left into a single bag. The rest of the house, the museum of curated perfection, no longer mattered. She sat behind the wheel of her car, staring at her own reflection in the windshield. The woman looking back at her wasn't the matriarch she once believed herself to be. She was simply a wife whose husband was ill, and a grandmother whose grandchildren didn't know if she loved them. That truth hurt more than the foreclosure, more than the gossip, more than the collapse of everything she had spent a lifetime building. In her lowest moment, she drove, not with a plan, but with instinct. She passed the street where Eleanor and the children once walked to the bus stop. She passed the church where they quietly attended holiday services. And finally, she found herself outside the gates of Eleanor's new home, clutching the steering wheel as if it might keep her upright. She hadn't come for money. She knew better now. She hadn't come for forgiveness. She didn't believe she deserved it. She came because the last echoes of her pride had finally faded, leaving behind a truth she'd ignored for too long. Love dies when it's not nurtured, but guilt lives forever when it's deserved. And yet, beneath all that pain, there was a lesson waiting to be born, one she never imagined she would learn this late in life. Sometimes you don't understand the harm you caused until life makes you stand in the exact place where you put someone else. Eleanor had stood outside these gates once, cold and terrified, begging for mercy she never received. Now it was Margaret's turn to understand what it felt like to be on the wrong side of a locked door. Her knock was hesitant, almost apologetic. When the gate opened, the guard didn't recognize her. She looked smaller, her posture no longer laced with superiority. She asked to speak to Eleanor, voice trembling, hands clutching the strap of her worn handbag. And, though fear pressed deep into her ribs, something gentler pushed her forward. The hope, however small, that humility could crack open a new beginning. But the next chapter was not about begging. It wasn't about guilt or punishment. It was about the unexpected path between brokenness and redemption, a path Eleanor would soon decide whether she wanted to walk with her or walk away from forever. Not every villain stays a villain. Some crumble, and some finally ask who they became along the way. When Eleanor stepped outside and saw Margaret standing at the gate, shoulders slumped, eyes rimmed red, clutching a handbag far too small to carry the weight of her past, it felt like time folded in on itself. This was the same woman who had once opened a door not to welcome her in, but to throw her out. The woman who spoke of pride more often than love. The woman who let her grandchildren shiver in the snow. And yet, there she stood, not like a villain, not like a queen, but like a mother who had finally run out of excuses. Eleanor didn't rush to greet her. She didn't soften. She simply watched, letting the silence speak first. It was Margaret who broke it. "I have no right to ask anything," she whispered, voice shaking in a way Eleanor had never heard. "But I need help, not money, just a chance to not die hated." It wasn't the apology Eleanor expected. It wasn't poetic or polished. It was raw, broken, like someone learning how to speak from the heart for the first time. Inside the house, the children watched from behind the windows. Mia pressed her palm to the glass, her expression troubled. "Mom," she whispered, when Eleanor stepped back inside. "Is she still mean?" Eleanor knelt beside her, brushing a hand through her hair. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly. "But sometimes People break before they change, and sometimes they change because they finally broke. Those words were not meant to justify the past. They were meant to teach a truth Eleanor herself had learned only recently. Revenge might feel satisfying, but redemption, when freely chosen, can change the shape of generations. Eleanor invited Margaret inside, not because she forgot the past, but because she refused to let the past dictate who she was becoming. Margaret stepped over the threshold like someone entering sacred ground. The warmth of the house hit her first. Then the laughter of children echoing faintly from the hallway. Her composure faltered. She stared at the framed drawings on the walls, the soft lighting, the gentle music playing from the living room. Everything a home should be. "They're safe," she murmured, almost to herself. "They're finally safe." Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth was hanging in the air between them. Over the next days, Eleanor allowed small, cautious interactions. She let Margaret sit with the children while they painted in the kitchen. She let her push Richard's wheelchair to the backyard patio, where the winter sun warmed his face. She let her read bedtime stories with a trembling voice that cracked on the softer lines. Margaret didn't ask for forgiveness. She showed it. Every morning she arrived early, volunteering to help wherever she was needed, never assuming she deserved inclusion. She cleaned dishes without being asked. She listened when Jonas struggled through sensory overload. She learned to braid Ruby's hair. She apologized through gestures, not speeches, to Mia for every cutting word she had ever spoken. But redemption is not a straight line. One afternoon, Eleanor found Margaret in the pantry, crying so hard she couldn't stand. "I ruined everything," she sobbed. "Even when I try to help now, I feel like I'm doing it wrong. How do I fix years of harm? How do I undo it?" Eleanor sat down beside her, her voice soft but firm. "You can't undo it. You can only do better today than you did yesterday. That's all any of us can do." That moment, two women sitting on a pantry floor, surrounded by canned goods and second chances, felt like a turning point. Eleanor realized that forgiveness wasn't a gift you gave once. It was a door you kept open, just a crack, for someone willing to walk through it, step by step. As the weeks passed, the children slowly began to trust their grandparents again, not because Eleanor pushed them, but because Margaret earned it. She attended therapy sessions voluntarily, doing the painful work of understanding the cruelty she once labeled as discipline. She offered to help at Eleanor's budding foundation, not in an office or on a board, but in the shelter kitchen, serving meals to mothers who looked far too much like the woman she had once thrown out. The first time she handed a warm plate to a young mother with tear-stained cheeks, Margaret's hands shook. She understood, perhaps for the first time, the true weight of dignity. And redemption, Eleanor realized, wasn't just for Margaret. It was for the children, too. Mia learned that people can change. Jonas learned that apologies can feel safe. Ruby learned that love is something you rebuild, not something you lose. And Eleanor, who once believed her heart was too fractured for grace, learned that strength is not the absence of pain, but the decision to rise above it with compassion. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and cast golden light across the backyard, Margaret approached Eleanor quietly. "I know I can't undo the past," she said, "but if you'll let me, I want to spend whatever time I have left building something better than what I gave you." Eleanor looked at her at the tired lines on her face, the remorse carved deep as roots. Forgiveness didn't come as a rush of emotion. It came as a small, steady exhale. "Then build it with us," she said. "Not above us, not behind us, with us." That night, Eleanor realized something powerful. Redemption is not owed, but it is possible. And sometimes, the greatest transformation doesn't happen when the good becomes stronger, but when the broken choose to heal. But Eleanor's journey wasn't finished, because with her new home, her new purpose, and her restored family, there remained one final step: building something lasting, something bigger than all of them, a legacy of hope. When one woman stands back up, sometimes an entire neighborhood rises with her. As the seasons shifted and the cold thawed into the gentle greens of early spring, Eleanor found her life expanding in ways she never imagined possible. What began as a fight for survival had grown into a mission, one that reached beyond her children, beyond the walls of her new home. The foundation she'd quietly begun sketching during sleepless nights had evolved into something real, something breathing, something needed. Every statistic she'd read echoed the same truth. Nearly 2.5 million children in the U.S. experience homelessness each year, and most of their mothers carry stories eerily similar to hers. Stories of silence, fear, pride, and a world that rarely makes room for their struggles. She couldn't erase her own past, but she could rewrite the present for families who were still living it. The Foundation for Families in Crisis opened in a refurbished warehouse on the east side of the city, where the paint was still drying on the brick walls and sunlight poured through high industrial windows that once lit machinery instead of hope. Eleanor didn't want the sterile feel of a charity office. She wanted a space that felt warm, safe, lived in. She filled the lobby with soft sofas, donated toys, and shelves of books for every age. There were no cold check-in counters, no harsh questions, no clipboard interrogation, just a team trained to see people, to listen, to welcome without judgment. On opening day, Eleanor stood in the middle of the room and watched as families filtered in, hesitant, exhausted, hopeful. Mothers with babies on their hips, fathers hiding embarrassment behind forced smiles, teenagers pretending not to be hungry. It felt overwhelming, this sudden closeness to so many stories, but it also felt right, because for the first time, the pain she once carried alone had become a source of strength others could lean on. Each day brought new faces, new heartbreaks, and new reminders of how deep the cracks in the system ran. A young mother named Tara arrived with 2 toddlers and a backpack of clothes, trembling because she'd left an abusive partner the night before. A retired grandmother raising 3 grandkids on Social Security came in desperate for food and school supplies. A teenage boy who'd been living behind a gas station asked if they had a shower he could use before school. Eleanor listened to them all, not as a savior, but as someone who knew, viscerally, what it meant to feel invisible. She noticed the way people flinched at kindness, the way they apologized for needing help, the way they whispered, "I'm sorry," every time they accepted a meal or a blanket. That was when she realized her work wasn't just feeding stomachs, it was feeding dignity. Slowly, the foundation became a haven. Volunteers from all over the city signed up. Students, retirees, business owners, church groups, single parents who came to give back what they once received. The most unexpected volunteers were the Whitlocks themselves. Margaret requested no special treatment, no titles, no recognition. She worked in the kitchen, scrubbing pots and preparing meals. Richard, with his slow but steady recovery, read stories to the younger children during afternoon quiet hour, his voice soft and uneven, but filled with sincerity. And, the community noticed, rumors about the Whitlocks' fall from grace had spread quickly, but their transformation traveled slower, less sensational, but far more meaningful. Margaret became someone mothers confided in. Richard became someone children trusted. Eleanor watched their efforts with cautious gratitude, understanding that redemption doesn't erase pain, but it can transform it into something worth keeping. But the true magic happened when Eleanor saw changes in her own children. Mia started leading art circles for younger kids, teaching them to draw their fears and color their hopes. Jonas helped set up sensory-friendly rooms where overwhelmed children could rest without judgment. Ruby became the unofficial greeter at the foundation, handing out stickers and hugs with confident joy. Even little Benji, still learning to talk, toddled around the lobby, handing people crayons and soft toys. They weren't just healing, they were helping others heal. And Eleanor realized that trauma passed down through generations could be broken just as powerfully by compassion. The community grew beyond what anyone expected. Partnerships formed, schools reached out, local businesses donated food and resources, and Eleanor, once a mother surviving on crumbs of hope, became a woman people looked to for leadership, guidance, and courage. She never pretended to have all the answers. She simply showed up every day with the same intention, to make sure no one felt as alone as she once had. And through that simple, persistent effort, the foundation became a beacon of possibility in a city that had learned to look away from its most vulnerable. One evening, as she stood in the quiet lobby after all the families had gone, Eleanor looked around at the lights dimming slowly, the toys neatly placed in bins, the lingering warmth of laughter still hanging in the air. She thought of her past, the van, the cold nights, the fear of tomorrow, and felt a soft ache for the woman she once was. Not pity, not regret, just deep, profound gratitude for the journey that taught her this truth. Pain can break you, but it can also open doors you never imagined walking through. And when you walk through those doors, you don't walk alone. You carry others with you. She locked up the building for the night, stepping out into the cool air with a sense of clarity she'd never known. The next chapter wasn't about recovery anymore. It was about growth, sustainability, vision. She was ready to build something permanent, something that would last far beyond her own lifetime. Some legacies are built from wealth. Others are built from surviving the impossible. As the foundation grew from a single building into a movement, Eleanor found herself stepping into a role she never imagined. Not just a survivor, not just a mother, but the architect of a legacy. A legacy not built from wealth alone, but from every wound, every cold night, every moment she once believed she wouldn't survive. And the astonishing thing was how naturally it unfolded. One morning, as she watched volunteers unload boxes of coats for winter distribution, she realized she no longer felt like an outsider visiting someone else's world. She belonged here, in this chorus of compassion, in the quiet planning meetings, in the late-night brainstorming sessions where she and her team discussed new programs for families who had nowhere else to go. Her name, Eleanor Ruiz, appeared on billboards and brochures, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a reminder that transformation doesn't begin with money. It begins with choosing to rise. The foundation's second location opened in a renovated school building on the west side of the city. Classrooms became transitional housing suites. The old gym became a community kitchen. Hallways, once filled with lockers, now held bulletin boards filled with job postings, daycare schedules, and workshops on financial literacy, resume writing, mental health, and parenting support. Children's laughter echoed from rooms painted in bright colors. Teenagers attended tutoring sessions or learned practical trades through partnerships with local businesses. For many, this wasn't just a temporary stop. It was the first stable environment they'd ever known. And every time Eleanor walked through those halls, she felt a recognition deep in her bones. This is what healing looks like when it's shared. But legacy is not only measured in buildings or programs. It is measured in people, like Tara, the young mother who arrived battered and terrified, who now worked full-time at the Foundation's Child Care Center, helping other women take their first steps toward independence, or the teenage boy who once showered in secret before school, who now volunteered in the tech room, repairing donated laptops for families starting over, or the grandmother raising 3 grandchildren, who became the Foundation's most beloved community liaison, bringing in families who had fallen through the cracks. Watching them grow made Eleanor realize something profound. Her story wasn't the centerpiece of this movement. It was simply the spark. The fire belonged to everyone who stepped through the doors, ready to rewrite their own fate. Still, perhaps the most powerful part of her legacy lived inside her home. Her children, once fearful and fragile, had blossomed into confident, grounded souls who carried kindness like second nature. Maya designed murals for the Foundation's hallways, each one filled with bright, sweeping colors that felt like visual hope. Jonas, thriving with the right support, created a sensory-friendly playroom that became a haven for countless neurodiverse children. Ruby developed a youth storytelling circle where kids practiced sharing their truths without shame. And little Benji, his laughter a symbol of everything they'd overcome, ran through the halls like sunshine in motion, loved by everyone who met him. Their healing became living proof that trauma could be interrupted, redirected, transformed. Even the Whitlocks became part of this legacy in a quiet, unexpected way. Margaret continued working in the Foundation kitchen, no longer out of guilt, but out of purpose. She formed deep friendships with the mothers she once would have dismissed. Her voice softened, her shoulders relaxed. She learned to listen, really listen, to struggles she once ignored. Richard, with the help of physical therapy, regained enough mobility to run story time twice a week. Children gathered around his wheelchair, hanging onto every word. For a man who once believed success was measured in business deals and social standing, this new life, reading to children, volunteering at community events, became the purest success he had ever known. In the quiet moments, Eleanor sometimes watched them from afar, marveling at how life had reshaped fortunes in ways no one could predict. Redemption, she realized, wasn't just for them. It was for her too. It was the freedom to let go of bitterness and build something stronger in its place. But the full meaning of legacy didn't settle into Eleanor until the night of the Foundation's first citywide gala. It wasn't a luxurious charity event filled with diamond necklaces and silent auctions. It was a celebration open to everyone: families, donors, volunteers, shelter residents, teachers, nurses, and community members who believed in change. The room buzzed with warmth. Children played tag between tables. Mothers laughed with women they once stood beside in food bank lines. Elders shared stories of resilience. It felt like a living tapestry of humanity stitched together by shared hope. When Eleanor stepped onto the stage, she wasn't nervous. She felt rooted, steady, anchored by every soul in that room. She didn't read from notes. She didn't need them. Her voice rose clear and strong as she said, "A year ago, my children and I slept in the back seat of a van. And tonight I stand here not because I was strong enough to survive, but because people were kind enough to help, kind enough to see us. And that is the legacy we are building together. A community where no one disappears, where no one suffers in silence, where every person, regardless of their past, has the chance to begin again." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was thunderous, not because of Eleanor's story, but because her message echoed something deeply human. We rise highest when we lift each other. After the event, as the lights dimmed and volunteers began cleaning up, Eleanor stepped outside into the cool night air. She looked up at the sky, the stars shimmering faintly above the city. Somewhere she imagined her great Aunt Lucinda smiling down, not because Eleanor became wealthy, but because she chose to turn that wealth into something living, breathing, meaningful. A legacy not of money, but of mercy, not of status, but of service. And Eleanor knew, standing there beneath the stars, that the story she carried would outlive her. It would stretch into the lives of thousands of families, echo through generations, ripple across communities that once felt forgotten. Her legacy wasn't a foundation. It wasn't buildings or programs or grants. Her legacy was the simple, radical belief that no one is beyond saving, not even ourselves. And from that belief grew a movement strong enough to light the dark for anyone still living their part one, the end, or perhaps just the beginning. If you believe stories like Eleanor's should be heard, tell me in the comments and share this with someone who needs hope today.